Hello, everyone. Welcome to Plant Magazine's Supply Chain Roundtable. We have a lot of great panelists from across the industry today. I'm Mario Sawinski, editor of Plant Magazine, and I will be your moderator. During Roundtable, we'll look at how the pandemic has exposed supply chain issues in the Canadian manufacturing sector. In turn, business uncertainty resulting from volatile trade issues and global disruptions are forcing manufacturers to examine their entire supply chain network. Our roundtable panelists include Stephen Cherlet, National Board Chair, Supply Chain Canada; Dennis Darby, President and CEO, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters; Mike Millian, President, Private Motor Truck Council of Canada; and Rajiv Sujan, Senior Director, Consulting, Digital Operations from PwC. We will now have each panelist briefly introduce themselves, and then we will get into discussion, which promises to be a good one. Let's start with you, Mike.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me today as part of this panel. Very proud to be here with such a great group of panelists. My name is Mike Millian. As you indicated, my background is in the trucking industry. I have been in it for 32 years now. Started out as a driver at the age of 18, called livestock locally for 3 years. And then I moved into a long haul company and spent 5 years running 48 states and 6 provinces, delivering refrigerated and general freight. From there, that's driving, that trucking company opened a truck driving school. I became a driver trainer for 4 years, moved into safety and compliance with them for a couple of years, moved into the private fleet industry and managed the fleet at the Hensel Co-op for 12.5 years. And then I took on this role as the president of the Private Motor Truck Council in January of 2015. And so far, 7 years later, they're still letting me keep this role. So that'll do it for me, and I'll pass it on to the next. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Stephen, go next.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to the panel, Mario. So my name is Stephen Cherlet. I'm located here in Montreal, Quebec. I'm the volunteer national board chair for Supply Chain Canada. So we're an association that represents 7,000 supply chain professionals across the country. And prior to that, I spent 35 years in the industry, primarily in operations and supply chain management.
All right, Rajiv, can you go next?
For sure. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Raj Sujan. I'm a senior director at PwC in our consulting practice. I focus on what we affectionately call digital operations, but more specifically, what that really means is I work with my clients across industries, a lot of which are in the manufacturing sector, on supply chain optimization, supply chain transformation projects. Can be anything from network optimization, process improvement, automation of operations, implementation of new technologies, etc. Looking forward to the discussion today.
And Dennis.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mario, and thank you to my fellow panelists. So CME is the oldest trade association in Canada. We just started our 151st year, founded in 1871, and so we represent that broad range of manufacturers and exporters across Canada. I got to start serving as the president and CEO just 5 years ago. Spent most of my career at Procter & Gamble, which is a big consumer products company. I'm an engineer by training and did mostly R&D and plant startups around the world. So I've worked in most continents, starting up manufacturing facilities. So, and at the end of the day, we try to do our very best to represent the needs of that whole broad sector. And obviously, a lot of these folks are either suppliers or partners to the industry. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Hey, thank you, everyone. On to the discussion at hand. I'll ask one question of the I'll ask each panelist a question, at which point they will have the first opportunity to answer. Once they are done, it will be an open discussion for everyone. We will start with Dennis. The COVID-19 pandemic, recent protests, blockades, and major world events have caused upheaval in Canada's supply chain. How do we address the ongoing problems, which include the conflict in Ukraine, the pandemic, and different protests?
I'm glad you started with an easy question, because of course that's an easy one to address. No, but seriously, I think what I wouldn't have predicted 2 years ago that at the end of the pandemic or near the end of the pandemic that we would be talking about supply chain disruptions. But that's what's happened, and in fact, and you're right, it's affected every part of our economy. And we just did a survey in the last month. We thought post the blockades, things were done, but now we've got the invasion in Ukraine. But over 90% of manufacturers and exporters have been affected in a significant way in terms of either increased costs or delays because of the the stretching of our supply chain and all the disruptions that have happened, everything from natural disasters to blockades to the pandemic shortage and the cost of containers. When we asked our members, what would help? Not maybe surprising to some people, more people. We don't have enough workers. So one thing that's really getting in the way of companies being able to recover is we don't have enough workers. There's not enough skilled labor, and we've been calling on the government to rebuild that pipeline of people. The second thing is we need incentives for growth. Companies are not, as much as you might think, thinking about trying to increase capacity here locally in Canada, because there are not a lot of incentives to build capacity. So, when we ask them, are you going to change your supply chain by building more capacity in Canada? It's not consistently clear. The one thing to help us get out of this, we have to do a better job with our infrastructure. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to everybody, I hope, that our road, rail, and port infrastructure is not strong enough, is not resilient enough, and governments have not invested enough money in, number one, keeping them protected, but number two, investing in our capacity. So that's what we heard from our members. It's not really that surprising, but it sure. And last thing I want to say on this one, our members are saying they don't even see an end to this until at least late 2023, and I think that's probably appropriate, given how long it will take to rebuild these things. So just as a starter, that's and I'm sure my colleagues have lots to say on this as well.
All right, let's open it up to the floor.
I think Stephen's got his hand up. You go ahead first, Stephen, and then I'll jump in.
So I would certainly agree with that. I think labor shortages are a critical issue. And I mean, there's a number of reasons for that. We've had labor shortages since before the pandemic, but that exacerbated them. Certainly, I've seen that here in Quebec. It's been a long time issue to try to find people, but it's across Canada. I do some work on the side besides my role at Supply Chain Canada. And what I'm hearing is labor issues across the country, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, and even customers in the United States. I'm getting that feedback. So I think that's a really big issue. And I think Dennis hit a few of the really good points about incentives and some government support. And I think what's causing things to be even more problematic now is that during the pandemic, people were shy to change jobs and weren't moving. But now that there's more of a tendency to work remotely and that's more acceptable, people are realizing they can work anywhere. And what I'm seeing with some in some organizations is there's a lot of turnover, because now that pent up job turnover is happening now. People are looking and moving.
I'll jump in here from the trucking perspective. And I guess I did say this to start, just so people know what the Private Motor Truck Council is. We represent private and dedicated fleets. And what that is somebody whose main business isn't trucking. So we actually have a lot of shippers and receivers in our membership as well. Because for those of you that don't know what a private or dedicated fleet is, think of a Home Hardware, a Tim Hortons, a Molson Coors, somebody whose main business is something other than trucking, but they have a large fleet of trucks to get that product or service out. So, so for our members are kind of on both sides. Right? We're on the driver's side trying to deliver the product. We've also got the manufacturing and shipping and warehouse side in our membership. So kind of allows you to get a bit of a different perspective sometimes from all different sources. But as far as the labor side goes, it's kind of two-found. I mean, I've been in the trucking industry for 32 years, and we've been talking about a driver shortage for 32 years. I'm one of the few people who had a view that a lot of people didn't agree with. I don't believe we've had a driver shortage for 32 years, because the second biggest thing in the industry was rates were too low. Well, I'm not an economics major, but it doesn't take much to figure out the rates would not be too low if there was a shortage of trucks out there to pick up freight. So we did have a shortage of drivers for the amount of trucks we had. The problem was the barrier to entry was too low, and there was too many trucks out there bidding on the same freight, which was keeping rates down. What we've seen happen since the pandemic hit, We now have a true chronic driver shortage. A trucking study by Trucking HR Canada come out. At the end of September of 2021, we had 22,900 vacancies. Now, like I said, a vacancy doesn't necessarily mean a shortage. It means you don't have a seat filled, but you might have too many trucks. Problem is, we've seen rates go way up because of that shortage to be able to get product moved. These vacancies this time, 44% of those vacancies had been for 90 days or longer. So these weren't temporary positions. And what has happened in the past is when there was a hot freight market and there was a shortage of trucks to get the products delivered, even though we said there was a driver shortage, we were somehow able to go out and flood the market with more trucks and fill them with drivers and remove that hot freight demand and then bring it back down again. Well, this time the pandemic has caused a lot of drivers to leave the industry for one reason or the other. It was already an aging workforce to begin with. And the second issue is you can't flood the markets with trucks. So even if you could find the drivers, because of the part shortages and the other supply chain issues, there's an 18-month wait to get a truck. So even if you could get drivers to fill those trucks, you can't get the trucks. So the shortage is definitely there for sure now on both sides. We don't have enough trucks now, and we don't have enough drivers in those trucks to get the products moving. And a lot of it because of, it was there before the pandemic, but as we've already said, the pandemic has certainly made it far worse, and the truck driving position is no different.
I'll maybe add in just a couple of quick comments as well. From a sort of supply chain consulting perspective, what we've observed with our clients is definitely throughout the pandemic, certainly through the first couple of waves, and then I think with the surprise of how fast Omicron hit, we did notice that our clients at all levels in supply chain, so all the way up to sort of EVP, SVP supply chain, chief operating officer level, went sort of all hands on deck. And I think they were dealing with the operational challenges. Like they took their attention away from maybe more strategic matters to sort of focus on the crisis that's right in front of them. And a lot of it, from what we saw, did link down to transportation chokes, labor shortages, just trying to keep the day-to-day operations running and to keep running with demand. But then I would say as we've gone through it, and every time there was like an ebb and flow through the pandemic, we found when our clients were able to come up for air a little bit, we found that there was this increased attention and effort on accelerating their investments. So they may have had projects that they had intended to do to digitize or improve the way their supply chain works before the pandemic. Now they were taking the opportunity to sort of spark and accelerate these investments so that they're better prepared as the disruption continues into the future.
All right, moving on to our next question. This one will be for Rajiv. Faced with a tight labor market and supply chain challenges in the future, what can businesses do to protect themselves when faced with these conditions? And what happens if there is a disruption, and who are the alternative suppliers?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first part of that question. One thing that we really wondered about as we got into the pandemic, being sort of a service provider where our business is all about helping our companies change the way they manage their supply chains, right? It's really about implementing new technologies, automating facilities, driving transformation to help them achieve best practices within their supply chains. One thing that we wondered at the early days of the pandemic, and I would say sort of repeatedly at various junctures throughout it, is whether the needs of our clients were going to change, whether they would be looking to do different things in order to withstand disruption in the future and to be better prepared. And interestingly, what we've found is it's actually much of the same. So if you look at the companies that were able to be resilient or maybe even thrived through the pandemic and through these terrible stages of disruption, the capabilities, the underlying capabilities that they have to plan and execute their supply chains are the same ones that have been known as the best practices for some time until now. So really what I would say is companies should be thinking about a few different things. One would be around their supply chain planning capabilities and how mature are their practices around forecasting demand, really using the best of cloud technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning in order to anticipate and predict demand in the near term, medium term, and long term. how they use that in order to plan their supply decisions around capacity, production planning, inventory strategies, et cetera. So I would say one vein is really around those demand and supply planning capabilities and how you best utilize those in order to factor not just what's known and going to happen in the future, but potential future scenarios and disruptions, and to do what if analysis. A second piece where we've seen sort of accelerated investments, and I think something that organizations should think about, is their supply chain networks and the physical footprint that they have of suppliers, plants, distribution centers, micro fulfillment centers, whatever different nodes they have in their network. Is it really the right footprint that they should be continuing to keep in the future, or are there optimization opportunities? Because optimization used to always be about cost and service, but now I think there's this third factor that's taking a lot more attention, which is resilience. It's not just how do we service at the optimal cost and service level, but are we capable of responding to disruption, and are we resilient for the future? And then I would say the third vein really comes down to the execution side of the supply chain, right? I'm talking plant operations, distribution center operations, and we're seeing organizations needing to automate more and looking to reduce their dependency on labor, be able to drive more automated facilities where you can scale up, scale down, you can stay nimble and resilient to fluctuations and future evolution of the business and the environment as well. So those are some things that I think organizations should think about, and those are all sort of real areas where I can point to several examples of companies where they've sort of sparked into action during the pandemic to say, you know what, we really need to take these things seriously now. Even if we knew it before, now we know for sure that we really need to build these things.
I think by the way, what Raj says is really, really appropriate, because when we asked our members, are you, because you've heard a lot about reshoring and bringing things back to Canada or the North America, and when we surveyed our members, very few of them are planning to change their supply chain locations. What they've talked about is that they need to adopt technologies, right? Because we haven't. One of the things that would be interesting to this group, even pre-pandemic, Canada's productivity, that's the output per worker, was well behind most of our peer countries. What that means is we tended to use labor instead of technology, right? We tend to use more labor, but not more technology. And as Russia, we have to change that paradigm. And so I think and I think there's a role for government. There's obviously a role for the private sector as well.
Yeah, I would second that. It's long been a pet peeve of mine, so I'll try not to get on the soapbox about lagging productivity and lack of investment in Canadian business. I think that's well documented, and I think to the point that Rajiv and Dennis have brought up is there are things we can do. There's technology ways to try to understand what's going on better, and we can talk about supply chain visibility and Internet of Things to know where freight is it moving, is it where is it stuck, how can we break through the log jams. A part of the question was around alternate suppliers, and I think these peaks in transportation cost, if they stay high, because I would never have believed a container would cost $10,000 from Asia, and I think peaks have been double that. So if we look at the total cost of acquisition, like the total cost of my supply chain, not just the unit cost, but look at the cost of getting it to me and the time delays, in that transportation, then I think it could change people's calculation and where they're going to look for their suppliers. I know some organizations have been looking closer to home, and although it might be a bit more expensive, certainly transport is helping offset that right now. So I think people are really lifting as they get time to breathe, to Rajiv's point, as they get time to breathe and lift their heads up, they're looking a little bit closer to home. But I think also we'll see new entrants into the market. Certainly if we look at personal protection equipment, there's a lot of new entrants into the market, so we will be able to look closer to home. So I think that's all part and parcel of what's going on.
And just to tag on that before I pass it on to Mike, the data we pulled is about one in five manufacturers are actually looking at sourcing differently from not where they currently are. So most of them are saying we're going to try to adopt technology, but you're right. There will be something we haven't seen in years, because we went back to a 3 or 4 year old survey and there was very little discussion of this. So I think I think it's shone a huge light on that whole issue. Over to you, Mike. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. So I'm going to stick to the truck driving, excuse me, part of things. And the automation part, despite what everybody wants to believe, isn't really going to help with the productivity of your classical long haul regional truck driver right now. I know we have lots of people saying, well, we'll have trucks driving themselves down the road en masse in 5 years. And I don't expect to see trucks operating down the highway without a driver in them somewhere on much of a scale at all in my lifetime. And I hope my lifetime is a couple decades or more yet. So is the role going to change? For sure, it's going to change. It already has. We see the trucks are becoming more technological. We have advanced collision mitigation system, lane departure systems, rollover systems, all the tools that are there that can make this truck operate by itself on a lot of occasions. But the thing is, they all rely on sensors, and they all rely on connectivity with the infrastructure. And as one, I forget which panelist mentioned it, but we have an issue with our infrastructure that is right now trying to maintain just the pavement and opening up more lanes to build redundancy. So we're a long way off from having radars on the side of every highway that can communicate with the truck to keep these things in their lane. And sensors are still going to fail. So we're still going to need drivers. Where we need to increase our productivity from a trucking industry end, and we shippers and carriers have to work together on this, we have got to massively solve our downtime issues. We cannot have drivers sitting at warehouses 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours, sometimes 1 or 2 days, not getting unloaded. And their clock eating up where they're losing their productivity time. They're allowed to drive 13 a day in Canada, 70 hours on duty in a 7-day period. In the States, 11 in a day. Well, if you sit at a dock for 8 hours and drive 11, 14 on duty, you've just lost half your day. So that's how we're doing a terrible job of using the efficiency of our drivers, is we have to cut the delays out of the systems. We have a driver show up for an appointment, they have to be unloaded. You can't leave them sitting there. And trucking companies need to start charging for this. And I think you're going to see more of it, and not just taking it as free time. So that's one way we have to do it. We can increase the efficiencies by making sure we work together better, to make sure we do scheduling better, fill our vehicles up better, keep drivers moving up and down the highway. I think the way we can avoid some of these labor shortages from a good company standpoint in the future, companies got to change the way they're doing business. And we're starting to see it change over, but from a trucking end, specifically long haul, that's where your turnover is the highest. It's nothing to see 80-90% turnover in the long haul trucking industry, which it's hard to run a business that way. You're paying by the mile, and you're paying by a drop. Drivers aren't getting paid when they're sitting in rush hour traffic. They're not getting paid when they're sitting in a loading dock. People don't want to work that way. It was the standard that's been around for years, but times have changed. We go to work. If the internet crashes and we can't work for a few hours, do we sit there and not get paid? I think the answer is no. We still get paid, right? So we can't put the inefficiencies that I just talked about in our system on our drivers. And there's a good company in our membership, and I didn't ask their permission to give their name, so I won't. But they pay their drivers a base rate. It's a salary. And then anything over 50 hours, they get paid overtime. They work under 50, they still get the same rate. Their turnover, and they are regional and long haul, their turnover rate is under 5%. They have waiting lists for drivers. So it can be done, but we got to start paying them for all their time. We got ways of tracking drivers better now, so we shouldn't have to worry about them wasting hours. We got to start paying them by the hour or by salary, and not expect them to pay for the inefficiencies. And that's one way you'll solve your turnover rate and help alleviate some of the shortage issues we're talking about. The other issue we got is getting trucks in, and that's a difficult one to manage. Normally, you don't go pick a truck up off a lot like you do a car. So normally in good times, you order them. You order your truck and you're 6 to 12 months out. We're looking at 18 now, sometimes longer. Companies have just been hanging on to trucks longer. That doesn't help you expand, but it also ratchets up your costs in repairs. So that one's a bit of a tougher one to challenge, because it's not like you can order these things and have them tomorrow at the best of times. And now we're 18 months out. So it's hard to plan for a situation like that came up when it comes to equipment.
Dennis, you mentioned reshoring. Should Canadian manufacturers be looking at reshoring as a solution?
Well, we asked the question because it is that what we, is that how you want to approach? We asked members, how do you approach, the shortages, and most of them didn't choose reshoring. Maybe 1 in 5, and that's a relatively small number. A whole pile of reasons. One of them is, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have the labor we need to be able to put more capacity here. And Canada, regrettably, is a very expensive and complicated place to put capacity. We've been underinvested for years. And so it's one of those things where associations like all of us here have been saying, hey, you know what, the governments need to do more to attract investment. Well, now we actually need to attract investment. If you're going to, and we don't have the systems in place. And the risk for us as Canadians, or as Canadian manufacturers, and everyone on this call, is that the US will get the vast majority of that new investment, right? And Canada will get shut out. And I think there's a political level around Buy America that we have to overcome. But the other thing is we need to make sure the American-owned businesses or international businesses see us as a cost competitive, reliable supplier. That's how so maybe our best hope is to try to convince companies to reshore for North America. I don't think many companies are going to reshore just for their Canadian production, because it doesn't make a lot of sense economically. It is difficult and slow. So I think you're going to see. I think the U.S. has already shown that on some symbolic big categories there have been some major announcements of bringing production back to the U.S. because it's such a huge market. Canada, we're going to have to step up, and I think there is a role for industry along with government. U.S. is our biggest trading partner. We need to remind them that we're reliable and that we're effective, and we haven't had to do that for a number of years because of the on fire U.S. economy. So they take everything we can produce. But now I think you're going to start seeing a little bit more. We're going to have to become more competitive, to use a term that's overused.
If I'll just jump in there too, and I would 100% agree. And Dennis, what you said too, bringing it here just to serve a Canadian market, I think would be a humongous challenge. The scale of economics just aren't there, right? Like we're too small, but the advantage and sometimes disadvantage we have is there's a very huge trading partner just across the border from us. So what we need to do is again, we look at all the auto manufacturing we had in Ontario for years and years and years that were all great paying jobs. It's not like they all started here. They were mainly US companies, but they expanded their processing up into our country and use that relationship and partnership. And that's what I think we're going to have to get back to. Onshoring is going to mean we have to bring it back to North America more, and then hope that we convince the US that a lot of that also needs to be brought up here. The US isn't the only country we're seeing doing this through the pandemic, and we all have to do it. When we see the challenges in the supply chain, when we have too much reliant on 1 or 2 markets, as we've seen with the microchip shortage, and we want everything to come over from Asia or Europe, when that supply chain breaks down, and the pandemic, of course, illustrates it more, but when that supply chain breaks down and you don't have 5 different regions of the world that you're sourcing it from, but you got one, I mean, to be blunt, you're pretty well screwed. And then we all started ordering from home, which increased how much products were coming in. And even if we could get the product in here, what we found out was we have some work to do on our own ports, like the infrastructure in the ports of LA and the ports of Vancouver. It wasn't, part of it was the product couldn't get here, but when it did get here, we had boats sitting out on the ocean for a month sometimes in LA. And then when it did get onshore, the systems and the infrastructure weren't set up. People couldn't find out where it was. Right? We were blaming, and the US government at the start was blaming the container shortage back up on truck drivers, and we needed to get more drivers. So then they opened the port up to 24 hours a day. We had trucks going in there, turning around and going back home after a 14-hour day and not picking up a single container. So the issue wasn't the drivers. In that case, the issue was the infrastructure wasn't set up, and they were overwhelmed with the amount of product coming in, and they just couldn't get rid of it. And so we have a bunch of issues we have to solve, but we have to get more of that here so we're less reliant on everybody else and have multiple options. I was reading an article the other day, the microchip shortage. think it's only 12% of microchips are now built in North America for our supply. The rest is sourced elsewhere. And I believe they said in the 1990s, 40% was supplied here. So that right there says we definitely need to bring some of this back in from my standpoint.
Yeah, I would second pretty much all of those sentiments. And I think you're both right that if you're reshoring, it's not just for your specific, very local geography. You've got to be looking at a bigger region. And I think that's kind of the trend is the reshoring is for a region. So, you know, like a large American company is not going to maybe close an operation in China and try to build everything for the world back in North America. They're still going to keep operations in the region to support sales in that region. And they may repatriate back to their home geography what they're going to sell in that geography. So I think as Canadian manufacturers, we have to look to expand our capacity and maybe to bring some work back home. But we have to look at the broader market. But to the points that have been raised, you know, we have to be competitive. And I think I've seen it over the years that, you know, when the dollar is weak, it's easy to be competitive. But if the dollar ever gets back up to par or closer to par the way it was for a while, then we have no choice. We have to compete. And I think it's something we have to really be cognizant of, that we need to be competitive even when the exchange rates are not in our favor. So that means we've got to look at infrastructure for sure. We have to look at investment in plant and equipment. But we also just have to look at, you know, working smarter rather than harder, because to address our labor shortages, we have to look at waste in the whole manufacturing, you know, in a manufacturing facility, and also outside, to the points that Mike was raising, you know, all this lost time of people, you know, waiting for a truck to be unloaded, that's waste. And we have that going on in our factories as well as, you know, distribution centers and warehouses. So we really have to focus on, you know, waste reduction and really adding value like at every step, and, you know, as much of the day as we can, and, you know, at a lot higher level than we have been traditionally.
All right, our next question will be for Stephen. Plant Magazine recently ran a poll on its website asking visitors when they believe the current supply chain issues will end. The majority of them said that it would be over a year. When do you believe that the current supply chain problems will subside, and why?
Yeah, I wish I had a perfect answer for that, but I believe it is going to be a year or even longer. I think there's just so much going on, because there's long and short-term things happening all at the same time. So the pandemic may be winding down, but we've got, you know, trends that have been started, say, as we've talked about in terms of labor and where people want to work and how they want to work. So that's going to be a hangover for quite a while. We have the issues around, you know, gas and oil supplies on a global basis. I think that's going to have a huge impact for a while to come. So there's a lot going on, and I think it's going to be more than a year. How much more than a year, I would be reluctant to say, but it's going to be a long time, I think, before some of these things subside. And then, of course, we've got, you know, other issues going on in terms of, you know, climate change. And we're seeing the impacts, like if we look at the floods and the fires on the West Coast having impacts that are just unforeseeable. These are going to continue, and they're going to continue to be relatively unforeseen. So I think we're going to have these shocks to the system on a fairly regular basis. So we may kind of recover in a gross mode, say in a year or just over, but then we'll have these recurring shocks that I think are going to cause ongoing turbulence.
Yeah, no doubt on top of what Stephen said there, that like I think the speculation around when this phase of disruption will end, I think it's anybody's guess, but I think we all know that it's not going away tomorrow or anytime in the near future. It's gonna, I would agree, a year plus. I think the more important sort of perspective is that this stage of disruption, or more importantly, uncertainty, is going to continue for some time to come. Like, I think the question around how long is this going to last, I think that was a very common question about a year and a half ago during the first few months of the pandemic, but the question was about the pandemic. Now it's the pandemic, the floods, the blockades and protests, the invasion in Ukraine, inflation skyrocketing. Like it's a laundry list of things that are contributing to supply chain disruption from many different angles. And I would say some form of those, and maybe new ones that we haven't seen yet, are going to continue for some time to come. And probably the more important thing is to just be ready for continued uncertainty and continued phases of disruption that could be there for basically perpetuity going forward. And I think that's, from a supply chain perspective, I think that's what we should prepare ourselves for, right? Because it's not about how do we survive the storm or how do we firefight today. I think it should be about how do we learn some lessons from the situation, build the right capabilities, and then be resilient when times are tough, and maybe be able to thrive and be even more competitive when times are good.
And we have talked to some members, and the people are looking at changing their inventory levels. They're looking at there's a huge inflation effect. There's an inflation effect that comes from these kind of disruptions, because either you're planning ahead, or you're going to be faced with higher costs, when during those periods, whether it's for transportation or to get materials. So I think the whole this disruption, which we think will go on for a year or longer, is really contributing to that inflation that we're all experiencing.
And I think one thing we're going to have to look at as well, because what the pandemic showed was how tight our supply lines were already working. They looked good because everything was always on the shelves. Everything you needed was always there. But everything had switched over to this just-in-time mode of freight for the last 15, 20 years. And as long as everything's ticking along, it's great. As soon as you have any disruption, and COVID was obviously a worldwide pandemic, a pretty major disruption. As soon as you have any disruption, it shows the frailties of a just-in-time system, where you don't have that inventory to reach out to while you get through the initial shock of a change. And then the floods in BC, we talked about our infrastructure. Well, you can't fix that infrastructure deficit in a short period of time, right? That takes years to rebuild that infrastructure. So, we had 3 highways cut off. Vancouver was basically cut off from the rest of the country. Well, when you don't have warehouses sitting there, they did amazing work and got a highway partially open within a week. And we thought it was going to be cut off for months. They had all 3 highways open within 2.5 months, which was amazing. But with no inventories in place, within 2 to 3 days, you start to deal with the shortages, right? And understanding you can't have inventories in place for perishable food items and stuff. There's some things you're going to have a shorter inventory, but we're going to have to start building back more inventory and keeping more stock to deal with these shocks to the system that we're going to deal with. And the catastrophic weather issues are something that are going to get more prevalent. They're not going away. The costs are going to be there for a while for the increase. Fuel's gone up 40 cents in the last week and a half, right? That has to be added to the bill. And we were already at 31-year highs for inflation. So the inflationary costs are going to be with us for a while. But yeah, I would say at least a year, and great point. It's like it's never really going away, but to overall fix the supply chain issues, the infrastructure in the ports, the infrastructure on the highways, dealing with our labor shortage issues, which some of that is going to involve, bringing in more immigration over here to fill these shortages. These are things that, you don't fix overnight or even in a year or two. These are long-term systemic issues that we haven't been dealing with enough in the last 15 to 20 years, which are now going to take a while to address to get truly over everything.
Now, our next question will be for Mike, and sort of jumps off of what you were talking about. What can governments in Canada, whether federally, provincially, and municipally, do to help businesses alleviate supply chain issues?
Well, again, I'm going to stick from the truck driving end for our end. When I say truck driving industry, we talk about driving positions, but it's really the whole industry where you get a shortage of drivers, we get a shortage of mechanics, we get a shortage of claim specialists. So there's all sorts of jobs we need to fill, just like there is in any other industry. But the driving and the mechanic one is we talk about the most. I think first thing governments can do, and we've been asking for it for years, is declare the truck driver occupation a skilled trade, because right now it's not considered one. There's a massive shortage of jobs in trades in general, but trucking is even further behind because we're not considered a skilled trade yet. And that closes the doors to a lot of funding that people can get to go through for training. So first thing is we got to get that declaration of skilled trade. It opens up more funding options. It also opens up better opportunities for you to be able to recruit foreign workers on a path to immigration to come over here when you have that skilled trade designation. So that would be one of the first things we would ask. We need governments to help us out with increasing funding for people to take entry-level training programs. Because like I said, right now, without it being declared a skilled trade, you can't get a student loan for this. So most people's access to funding to go through training from a truck driver end is when they're on unemployment. And that isn't really a good solution, because are they going to do the training because they want to be a driver, or are they going to do the training because they're unemployment and that's where they're being pushed because they have to do something to stay on unemployment and there's a need there? Which, if they come into the industry and don't really want to be into it, that doesn't solve our problems or the government's problems. You're just pushing somebody in who's going to leave in 6 months or a year. So we have to open up funding options other than the ones we have now, which is basically unemployment. If it's a job of first choice, the funding needs to be there right off the bat to help them get into it. Other things we need to look at is we got some massive issues with insurance in certain parts of this country. Ontario is one of the worst right now for trying to get affordable insurance. Anybody under the age of 25, if you want to work, you pretty much have to go to a large fleet. Over 90% of the trucking companies in the country are still 10 trucks or under. Well, if you're a family-run business and want to bring your son, your daughter, other family members or friends into that trucking industry to start a trucking career, you won't be able to hire them because you won't be able to get them under your insurance. They're going to have to go work for somebody outside of your company and get the experience before they can come back and work at yours. So we have to figure out how we're going to address that. A lot of insurers have left the market because it's simply not profitable because of the high insurance claims and lawsuits. We call them nuclear verdicts. So it's hard to blame the insurance in some circumstances. You have to make money. So if you have a section that isn't profitable, people back out of it. That reduces your competition. But governments have to figure out ways of helping the industry to, I don't know if it's subsidize it or what it is, but we have to figure out ways of making it so reputable trucking companies are able to get insurance and bring on drivers that have had the proper training. And I guess a big thing from a public standpoint and from drivers that are already here, but keeping them here, we've had a woeful inadequacy of safe, clean, well-lit parking for trucks to get the rest and access to clean washroom facilities. There's 3% of the truck drivers in Canada are women. Roughly 50% of the population is women. That's a massive occupation force that we're not tapping into properly. Some of the biggest concerns you hear from women is the security out on the road. Well, that's because of lack of clean, well-lit places to park and washroom facilities to use. This has been talked about for years, and it's something our governments need to invest in more heavily. I'll look at the US as an example. If anybody's been down there, do they have some parking issues? Yeah, they still have parking issues too. Parking shortages are issues everywhere, but go down their interstate systems. And in a lot of states, you see rest areas with parking on it, areas for trucks to go. We don't see that type of infrastructure here. They have got their female workforce up to 7%. So it's still a long way from 50-50, but they were about 4% 5 years ago, but we were at 2%, and they've almost doubled, and we brought it up 1%. So we've got work to do to close the gap. And I think these are some of the issues that could definitely help.
I think that add on to that one, I think what we're taught, one of the things that Mike's talking about is that in government, what can they do? They can invest in that infrastructure, and the infrastructure for a trade includes all those things that he mentioned, as well as improving the capacity at our ports. So I think there's a role for government there. There's a role for government to support that investment in technology we talked earlier. Huge role for them to invest, to help get, because you have to attract that investment. And goodness knows the U.S. is US states especially are so good at attracting investment. And we need people to adopt that technology. I mean, there was a good announcement, and I'm sure my colleagues have seen this. The government announced that $4 billion Canada Digital Adoption Program, which could help small and medium-sized businesses adopt some digital technology. But I'm not sure if that's enough, and I'm sure it's not sufficient. But at least it was a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I would build on that. I think there is a role for government, and I think to some extent, we've talked about tactics, but I think we need to talk about strategy.
Yep.
I think we need like a long-term vision and a strategy of where we want to go and what we want the future to look like in terms of supply chain and some of these core issues around talent, recruitment, retention, infrastructure, and all that. And I think the role is got to be, it probably should be government-led, but it's got to be industry supported. So like all my colleagues on the call today, we all represent different stakeholders in the economy and in in the supply in the true end-to-end supply chain. So I think it's got to be a collaborative role with consultation and feedback. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a game plan, and I think it should be well articulated. And I think it should get beyond those who are in all the meetings every day, but it should be articulated well and down to business and to the public as well. I think we all should have an idea of what the long-term goal is so that everybody can participate and contribute along the way.
All right, just looking at the time, I think we got time for one more question. So we'll leave this one open for everybody. So who supplies the suppliers and where are they sourcing materials from? Are the suppliers geographically close to their plants?
I'll start off with that. I can just talk to my, time in industry, which isn't that long ago. And we were sourcing globally. We looked across the globe for suppliers. But like many firms, in some cases, some of our materials we weren't looking at too broad of a duplication or of suppliers. But certainly, I think it's a global supply chain. I think it still will be, but people are going to be more cautious about it, and they're going to make sure that they have some redundancy in their supply chain. And just on a very simple note, I think what companies need to do is they have to really sit down and look at it. I think we all think we know what our supply chain is, but I do work with some customers, and when we sit down and we get a big map of the world and we lay out like a primary product and where all their core materials are coming from, and we start looking at the number of suppliers, even in just the top few materials that go into something they supply, and where they're located and the distances involved, because all that equates to time and cost, they're quite shocked. So when you roll that up, like the foundational people know where everything is, but they haven't necessarily put it all together. And when you bring that up to the executive team, they kind of don't believe you when you tell them that their materials basically traveled twice around the planet in terms of total distance to get a product out the door. And we haven't even looked at getting it into the distribution channel. We just looked at getting it there. So, buying stuff from Asia back and forth through subcontractors and other suppliers within even North America, it's huge. So I think people really need to take the time to map that out and understand it. Then you can start to decide, okay, where do I need to prioritize? What should I look to bring home? Where should I look for redundancy? Where should I look to make sure I've got alternate transportation channels instead of relying on single things? So I think part of it is just like internal education and understanding, and then people can move forward. But it's a global economy for sure.
And Stephen, and folks, when we asked our manufacturers across Canada, not surprisingly, about 3/4 of manufacturers source most of their materials, most of their supply chain from within North America, but 1/4 of it comes from outside. And it's often that stuff that comes from a longer distance, which is where the issues have come. There haven't been as many disruptions if you're for the manufacturers when we surveyed them who source just in North America. They've experienced the fewer delays or than those that source outside. But that's always that small percentage, because I had one group say, oh, it's only 25% outside of North America. No big deal. I said, yes, except that it's 25% that you need, right, for that particular product or for that car or for that vehicle. So I think it's I think it's true. We have to relook at where the government is basically, sorry, I didn't mean to ramble. The government has said, we're going to do a supply chain map working with industry. And we said, great, but this is going to be a bigger effort than you think, trying to do a real supply chain map of where we source, Canadian industry sources its materials. But we're game, and we're hopeful that some of you would participate as well.
I think that's a great point. I think what we need to do though is you have to look like a level deeper.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be, as you mentioned, a smaller portion that's at risk because of the distance and maybe the geographical risk. But even if what you're sourcing from within North America, where are they sourcing? And that's the question that we don't always ask, right? We don't go through that lean approach of asking why 5 times or where. So we get from you, where do you order from? Where does that supplier order from? So if you go back a couple levels, you might be quite shocked that a lot of material at the end of the day is getting to you back from that further distance or higher risk area. So
that's funny. And that's what we said. We said, be careful what you ask for, because this is a more complicated exercise than political folks tend to think.
That's a great point again there, Stephen, too. You may think you're sourcing 90% of your products from North America, but the North American supplier you're getting the product from is not getting that product from North America. A lot of people probably don't really think about that. But, and Dennis, to touch on your other one, 25% sourced outside of North America, great point. It sounds like a lot. You might have thought you were sourcing more than that outside of North America. But when we look at our vehicles right now, and not just, semi trucks, which are 18-month backlogs, and trailers, which are 18-month backlogs, go drive by your local car dealership, right? And there's no vehicles there, right? And what we've seen in the truck lots in a lot of cases, their yard at the assembly plant, it's lined up with trucks outside. Okay. And the truck is 95% built, but it's waiting on a shipment of armrests, or it's waiting on a shipment of seat belts, or it's waiting on a steering wheel or something. So most of the truck might be assembled, but it can't be shipped out till it's finished, and it's missing 1 or 2 parts that are coming from somewhere else where they can't get it over here. So, it's that whole issue. It's not like you source every component for a vehicle from the same supplier. And if you're missing one of them and it's an important, you can't finish the product. It might be sitting there 90% completed for 6 months before it ever leaves. And it's, we're seeing those massive issues now when, to build a truck or a car, Lord knows how many thousands of components it is and how many different countries they're coming from. And that's stuff that maybe we need to look at, making sure all these components that we need, we got to bring more of these back home or build some redundancy into it. Like you said, you still may have to source some of it, but we also need some redundancy of sourcing some of it here as well, because we all know as well, you bring everything back here and then the price skyrockets too much, you'll have a surplus that nobody will buy. So it's a fine line that we have to weigh into.
Only point I'll add to all of that is I think as ESG and sustainability comes more to the limelight, I think it adds an even higher level of emphasis on a lot of what we're talking about here around global sourcing and optimizing the sort of domestic versus import and where you're getting your inputs from.
All right. Anyone else have anything else that you want to say that we may have missed in the conversation?
All I could say is if people are watching this and thinking, by God, they'd probably be feeling pretty depressed by the end, but I'd rather look at it and say that there's a huge opportunity. And, as Raj said, especially through the lens of ESG and as we look at our competitiveness, I think there's a huge opportunity for Canada in this, despite how dire it seems right now.
One thing to keep in mind, we're talking about the issues in the supply chain. It's also good to keep in mind, despite what we've gone through the last 2 years as a globe, despite what we've gone through internally in Canada with the floods in BC, the forest fires out, the floods out east, but despite what we've gone through and despite the challenges, I think most of us can say in Canada, we're lucky enough that the majority of what we need, whether it comes to medicines, foods, all the essential items that we need, it's still there for us. So the supply chain is struggling and we've seen massive inflation, but as the supply chain usually does, we figure out ways to get done what needs to be done, and all this other stuff. There's challenges, we're gonna have to figure it out, but overall, I think we've all done a pretty good job of making sure what we do need, we still have.
Well said.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for this lively discussion about supply chain. Plant Magazine would like to thank all the panelists. Thank you.